From the place where we are right, wrote Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai in his heartbreaking poem about the wrongness of rightness. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. My dear Beth Am friends, our family's family, these past 13 years, I'm delighted to see so many of you in shul today, in person today. Honestly, I want to cry and sing and shout to the heavens how blessed I feel that despite new variants and fluctuating cases, we seem to have come through the very worst of this pandemic and emerged somehow on the other side. It has not been easy, has it? These past 3.5 years, when the world seemed to become a fundamentally different place. The ground has felt hard and trampled. There was a time when we might have wondered if spring would come, if flowers would grow again, but they have. Our congregation is flourishing. Our city and country have returned to something very much approximating the world we left behind. Hinenu, we are here. Amichai concludes his poem pondering the hard and trampled yard and offering some reprieve. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. However, I come today before you with a question, and it's not an easy one. Because while I'm grateful to be here with you, I think the time has come to take stock, to assess where we've been and how we got here. Because I fear that in the wake of COVID-19, something unsavory has taken hold in our society. And it didn't begin in 2020, but much earlier. Something inflexible and unyielding pervades our discourse and our decision-making. We have become subservient to rightness, which is to say, as we enter this new year, if we are to dig up that impervious ground, we must plow it with doubts and loves and the humility to ask, where have we gone wrong? It was April 2020, on Shabbat Hagadol, 5 days before Pesach 5780. You sitting in your dens or living rooms, me standing next to a bottle of hand sanitizer, speaking across this capacious, empty sanctuary into that camera. It's the height of absurdity, right? On that Shabbos, I put a challenge before us. I asked the question, how should we be now, I said, so we can be better then? And I think on this Rosh Hashanah, as we enter 5784, we owe it to ourselves to consider that question again, and whether we met the challenge of the moment. And if we didn't, what can we do now? In some ways, it's hard to imagine what it was like back then, when the pandemic was bearing down and hospital beds were filling up and so much was uncertain and terrifying, when the loss of basic norms was only eclipsed by the mounting loss of life. In that 2020 quarantine sermon, I said we yearn for all the things that we've lost. A baseball game in the midst of a roaring crowd, dinner at a favorite restaurant, sitting outside on a warm spring night, sipping a glass of wine and chatting with a loved one or family or friends amid the din of chattering patrons at tables within arm's reach. We yearn for a trip to the library or a movie or the supermarket without fear. We long for a big, raucous Seder, I said, with all the trimmings, people packing themselves into familial homes, warm embraces, singing, telling jokes and the stories of our ancestors, food and food and food again. But the crowded Seder was not to be. So we jumped onto Zoom and broke the middle matzah in front of our laptops. We discovered breakout rooms for discussions and shared war stories. We joked that whatever was happening to us, it was surely better than it had been for our ancestors in Egypt. They, of course, made bricks with straw. We made virtual minyanim and joked about everyone and whether or not they were wearing pants. In those early days and months, even as there was so much loss, there was also so much good. We discovered the generosity of spirit within our hearts and our souls. We had gushing gratitude for frontline workers, reverence for public health professionals. We watched musicians in Italy and Israel play concertos from balconies and passed along YouTube videos of upbeat choral arrangements, children and adults alike singing together in harmony from across the globe. We found our creativity. We sounded the shofar in neighborhood flash mobs and gathered virtually for backyard Havdalah, a Lag BaOmer Beit Cafe, where we showed off our various talents, Tikkun Leil Shavuot with 19 participating congregations and organizations from all over the Baltimore area. Some of us took up bread baking or mixology or flower arranging. Elia made an exquisite ball gown out of the New York Times and duct tape. We were a little silly. We bought back massagers and bidets for no good reason, and way too much toilet paper. But we were also adventurous, collaborative, open-hearted. When we were not fully in lockdown, we enjoyed nature. We noticed that with fewer cars on the street, fewer factories in operation, the atmosphere was better. The air was easier to breathe. We took more walks. We ate outdoors, even in inclement weather. We found our resilience. And in the summer of 2020, fed up with police brutality, many of us also found our voices, taking to the streets to fight for justice and equity. How did all of this affect us? There's good evidence that for a while our personalities actually improved, measurably. The National Institutes of Health uses 5 broad traits to describe personality. Studies show that in the early months of the pandemic, we experienced a measurable decline in neuroticism, which NIH says is, quote, a tendency for persistent and excessive pessimism and anxiety. Despite all of the challenges, not only were we more creative, we were also more optimistic and less anxious. In the beginning, it seems, we were in some ways better than we had been in a long time. But what do you suppose happened next? Unfortunately, the news is not so good. A study from 2022 found that those changes in neuroticism were short-lived and normalized by the second and third year of the pandemic. And the other 4 personality traits, agreeableness, openness, extroversion, and conscientiousness, declined during the latter stages of COVID. Now, just so we're on the same page, agreeableness here is a technical term. It's a tendency to be empathetic, friendly, compliant, and trustworthy. Openness is about curiosity and imagination. Extroversion to the NIH is a tendency to be outgoing, energetic, and assertive, and conscientiousness means we're organized, self-disciplined, responsible, and hardworking. So apparently, we are less empathetic, more closed-minded, more timid, and fairly disorganized, which if you come to my house, you'll see is true. And I guess all of that's a better way to put it than saying we're a bunch of narcissistic, incurious, irresponsible jerks. And sadly, my friends, the news is worse for our kids. Younger individuals already more susceptible to personality changes were hit hard during the pandemic, suggesting a disruption of the typical development of children and maturation process that occurs during young adulthood, which makes our question, our challenge, even more urgent. blame. Honestly, I don't care. How much we as a society, assuming we can make such collective claims anymore, are to blame for all of this is not my chief concern today. Separating the harm imposed by the virus from the self-harm inflicted by its hosts is the stuff of dissertations, not Rosh Hashanah sermons. Instead, I want to invite us to use this day to look back further. After all, today is a day of memory. You probably know, or at least you've noticed, that we have a tradition of not sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashanah when it falls on Shabbos. Why is that? The Talmud Yerushalmi describes the debate between Rabbi Abba bar Papas, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, 3 second-generation Palestinian Amoraim. Uncertain of what to do, they asked Rav Kahana, an erudite sage who was passing by, and he said to them, one verse says a day of blasts. That's in Numbers 29. Another verse says a remembrance of blasts. That's in Leviticus 23. B'sha'a shehu chal b'chol yom tru'ah. A day of blast refers to weekdays. B'sha'a shehu chal b'shabbat zichron tru'ah mazkirin aval lo tok'in. Remembrance of blast refers to Shabbat. We remember, but we don't sound the shofar. Hayom harat olam. Today is a day pregnant with possibility. We'll proclaim during Musaf whether or not we sound the shofar, but on Shabbat, when we're already searching our minds for memories of that wondrous sound, the possibilities of the future seem even more dependent on an accounting of our past. How should we be now so we can be better then, I asked. We know the answer as surely as we understand why things shifted after those first months of the pandemic. Because in those early days, we remembered why community is so important, our essential humanity, that we're accountable to one another. We yearned for contact, and we weren't afraid to say so. We found creative ways to reach across the divide, because deep down in our kishkas, we feared detachments, and we craved meaningful connection. How you brought back sanity, sang Israeli musician Hanan Ben-Ari to the virus in the song that I quoted to you back in 2020. We figured we'd conquered it all. Towers in the heavens we built. Man, who needs man, we told ourselves. No second flood will come in our time. Never will we fail. Forget it. We'll manage on our own. We're wise. We're right. We know the answers. There's nothing higher than us. Until you came and infected and crazed and confined and confounded and terrified us. COVID, for a minute, reminded us we are fundamentally social beings. Ga'agoim lifnei Adam, longing for human beings, is the name of that song. The 2020 quarantine was a wake-up call. It was the wake-up call that shofar is meant to be on Rosh Hashanah. It stirred our souls. It was paradoxically and painfully a manifestation of Amichai's doubts and loves crashing through the wall of rightness we had built around ourselves. We knew, and more important, we admitted that we were wrong. That's why the end of his song made so much sense back then. Od me'at z'akol yigamer v'ani mevakesh em afshar שבבוקר אחרי שתלכי לא נהיה שוב אותו הדבר. Soon, all of this will be over. And it's possible, if it's possible, I request that the morning after you leave, we won't go back to being the same. But my friends, we did. We went back. In fact, we got worse, didn't we? and the flowers that began to grow in the spring of 2020 withered as we retreated once more to cynicism, ignorance, arrogance, and fear. We continued cooking our planet, creating extreme weather events with extraordinary costs in blood and treasure. We're eroding basic democratic norms here in Israel and too many places around the globe. Hate speech has become de rigueur. Verbal and violent anti-Semitic attacks continue to rise. I could go on. So what now? Do we do yeush? Do we just despair? Shall we give up? This first day of 5784, we're faced with a question as essential as it is existential. How should we be now so we can be better then? We should probably start not with the place where we are right, but the place where we went wrong. Our virus is a lousy reason for being a mensch. It's unsustainable. The empathy and kindness generated by COVID were simply no match for the trauma that we went through. Most of that isn't our fault. Some of it is, especially in this country where we compounded the problem and left over 1 million dead. But again, assigning blame is mostly a distraction. Now, with some distance from the worst of it, we must move forward, and we can do nothing about the myriad challenges of this city, this country, or this planet if we cannot achieve one simple goal. We must listen to our craving for connection, that longing for human beings, our innate understanding that each of us is created in God's image, so has worth beyond the confines of our bodies or even our behaviors. Amichai's poem is not just provocative and comforting, it's redemptive. Listen closely to the end. The imagery should sound familiar to us. And a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. Hamakom isn't just a place, it's a name for God. Whispering is rabbinic imagery for prayer. The ruined house, Habayit Asher Necharav, is the temple laid waste. Love and doubts are a portal for holy connection and maybe even healing. The new year is upon us. There will be new and different challenges in the coming months, and the old ones, guess what, will linger with maddening stubbornness. But for a minute, the pandemic showed us we could be better. And on this Yom Zichron Truah, this day of remembrance of blasts, let's remember what we achieved 3 years ago, a resounding call for justice and humanity. Let's recall what it felt like to have more hope, more empathy, more love. Ulai yesh tikva, says Lamentations. Perhaps there is hope. Today is pregnant with possibility to devote our lives to a Jewish path. Is, in fact, to insist that there is hope. If these Yamim Noraim teach us one thing, it is that each year, every day, and every moment of each day, we can do better. Believe that. Convince others of that. Act on that principle. And this year can be a sweet new year. Shabbat Shalom. Shana Tova.